Going to call to order the Virginia Coastal Resilience Technical Advisory Committee Subcommittee funding. And with that, ask Wheeler Wood to take the roll call.
Okay, thank you. Good morning. Sean, I have you here, and Peter, I have you here as well. Bill Curtis. I see you, but you're muted. I'll take you as a yes. Whitney Katchmark.
Yes.
Ben McFarland.
Present.
Louis Lawrence. Curtis Smith. Kristen Burhop. Keith Martin. I have Andrew Smith. Robbie Coates.
Present.
Deborah Messmer. Chris Swanson. Chris Berg.
Here.
Good morning. Jamie Green. We're alternates Rachel Peabody or Randy Owen. I don't see them. And Troy Hartley. And then also on it, we have obviously Matt, Carolyn, and myself. And that is the roll has been called.
Thank you. You have before you an agenda. Does anyone have any changes to today's agenda? Hearing none, is there a motion to adopt the agenda?
So moved.
Do I hear a second?
Second.
All in favor? Just say aye.
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 The agenda is adopted. So next item on the agenda is adoption of the subcommittee meeting minutes that presented in your packet. Does anyone have any changes or any discussion on the meeting minutes? Hearing none, do I hear a motion to adopt the subcommittee meeting minutes from Q3? Motion. Yep. Okay, we got a motion. Do I have a second?
Second.
Thank you. All in favor of adopting the subcommittee meeting minutes from Q3, please say aye.
Aye.
Excellent. Any nays? Moving on. Thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Matt to review our subcommittee overview and summary.
All right, thank you, Sean. So just a quick overview of phase 2 of the Coastal Resilience Master Plan. Plan is due for delivery December of next year. 2 major deliverables, an updated PDF document and an update to our Coastal Resilience Web Explorer. The elements or components of those deliverables include the updated flood hazard exposure model that incorporates all major sources of flooding, an updated flood hazard risk assessment from those impacts of flooding, an inventory of planned resilience actions, financial needs and information for flood resilience, and then any subcommittee recommendations from the TAC or the TAC itself that we are receiving. This subcommittee itself is really focused on financial information that can help support planning and our planning efforts to be more resilient to flooding, as well as what is needed to implement some of the projects and initiatives, and how do we make those decisions with best available financial information. Looking at our schedule, we are in our Q4 meeting for 2023. We have 4 meetings remaining for this subcommittee, and we'll get into kind of what that schedule looks like for the remainder meetings. So in our first meeting, we talked about what are some of the different financial needs and information that could be presented in the plan. We're going to follow up with that today, and then working towards prioritizing those needs as far as what can we actually get done in phase 2 of the Coastal Resilience Master Plan versus what may need to be deferred, just based on scope, schedule, budget, availability, and resources for future efforts, but wanting to document those and kind of start working those into future plans and our recommendations. So that's a quick overview of where we stand. I'm going to turn it back over to Sean to introduce our guest speaker to provide an overview of some resilience tools.
Thank you, Matt. At the last meeting, it was brought up that, how do we incorporate some financial tools into the plan? And one of the topics that came up was tax increment financing or service districts financing. And last year, VRA through the Clean Water Revolving Loan Fund financed a living shoreline for a service district in Westmoreland County. And what that enabled that project to move forward. So only the houses or the residential development in that one area of the county is paying for that improvement. And we thought maybe this could be brought to the resilience space in a bigger way. So when I guess Louis Lawrence was the one that suggested it, I immediately thought of Jimmy Sanderson, who is a senior vice president at Davenport. Jimmy is a municipal advisor for nearly 20 years. And prior to his work at Davenport, he served as a bond counsel at Hutton & Williams. So a great background for us. Jimmy's been involved in a number of special districts or community development authorities. One of the bigger ones that comes to mind, if you're in the Richmond area, is the Short Pump development in Henrico County. And I'm sure Jimmy may mention a few others, but it's really taking some of the tools that exist and applying resiliency type of efforts. And I just want to introduce Jimmy. So away you go.
Thanks, Sean. Take it off mute. I appreciate the introduction. And, it's interesting. I testified is too strong a word. I had a conversation. I had a panel of the General Assembly, the House and the Senate Joint Committee on Affordable Housing. And they were asking sort of similar questions. What are some of the financial tools available to assist in affordable housing across the Commonwealth of Virginia? And it was a similar discussion, just what are the tools out there? Lots of questions from that group. I would suggest, feel free to interrupt me anytime as we have these conversations. I think it'll be helpful for me to try to give you a little bit of guidance and understand what you're looking at in particular. These are as far as resiliency projects, the one Sean noted are the types of things that we see in Virginia. I'll say I haven't seen sort of a common financing tool that our local governments have been using for this purpose. Many of them are using just their general revenues, whether that's a borrowing, using their own credit or pay-go funding. But certainly to the extent there are ways for local governments to think about these types of projects that may take the burden off of their budget side, I think that's the most important thing. Local governments are always strapped on their budgets, and certain things rise to the top of being important. And sometimes those things that are more longer lead implications on them sometimes move to the back burner. So any ability to move things forward obviously is helpful. So I thought I would focus on a number of things. If you flip to the first slide, Matt, this is a little bit more generic, and I'll dive into a couple of these in more detail. But again, the special tax district is similar to what the service district that Matt mentioned. again, is one that we've certainly seen. It provides a burden that's just on a certain district that's formed by the local government. That is a tool that is really at the control of the local government, gives them a lot more authority on deciding what that tax district is, what those monies will be used for. We'll get into a little bit more detail with that one. A CDA, similar in that it is a district that is just defined by some geographic boundary, and it is is formed under the state statute. It can be used to do certain infrastructure improvements within that geographical boundary, and the goal of it is to pay for those projects from within that specific area. And there is a concept of a special assessment and an ad valorem tax that can be used to generate revenues to pay for any projects within that area as well. I did want to mention, Sean passed on, one of the members asked me about TIFs in particular. It's interesting. I had the concept of a TIF in here before and took it out. TIF stands for tax increment financing, and is a tool that's often used in combination with a CDA to generate other revenues. The concept generally is, if you do an improvement within an area, the value of the property increases, or there is additional economic activity within that area. And the goal is to capture any incremental revenue that's over and above sort of the baseline within that district prior to those developments. And the local government uses those incremental revenues to pay for some projects, whatever projects they do within that area. That, in my experience, that tool is limited. There is a state statute that allows for TIFs. That's only been used in a couple of jurisdictions in Virginia, and not very frequently. We more often use what I'll call a quasi-TIF. It's just by agreement. A local government will use either a CDA, for example, or just draw a geographic boundary. There's no legality to it, but it's just used on their own books to determine whether there's incremental revenue that they use to pay for projects. They're often using their own credit to borrow for it under a GO or a moral obligation structure. That's how they borrow the money, and then internally they use the TIF concept to pay the debt, but it's not the obligation that actually pays the debt. But it certainly is a tool. I guess I would just look at it a little bit more of a challenge to use that structure for this type of project than a special tax district or a CDA. One thing that I did want to mention to this group are some regional taxing authorities that are out there. The state has looked at it with respect to transportation. There's the Northern Virginia Transportation Authority, Central Virginia Transportation Authority, and the Hampton Roads Transportation Authority. And those were established by the state for the purpose of paying for regional transportation projects, obviously in Northern Virginia, the Richmond area, and Hampton Roads, where we have significant transportation problems. And those were authorities that captured additional tax revenues within those areas. And so it was a very good way to allow local governments, both on a regional, and some of these monies flow back to the individual jurisdictions as well, for them to generate new revenue that can be applied specifically for an identified purpose. And I guess my point would be there's no reason that something like this couldn't be set up in various parts of the state where there are concerns and want to address specific issues related to your topic. Those three entities that have been set up, NVTA was the first one, I believe, in Northern Virginia. It's been around a long time. They have issued debt for larger regional projects. They do a lot of pay-go for transportation needs up there. Central Virginia one was just set up a few years ago, and they again are using PAYGO right now for some large projects, considering debt as well. HR TAC has done some borrowing as well. So just a tool that we don't have currently under Virginia code, but certainly one that theoretically could be set up that might satisfy the purposes that you are looking for. The last point is a general obligation or a moral obligation bond. That's how I would often see these types of projects done by local governments. They're issuing debt as part of their CIP, stormwater needs, or flood control needs that they might have. Obviously, those can be used in combination with a special tax district and a CDA as well. There may need to be some credit quality increase that a GO or an MO of the local government could provide. So let me stop there. Again, any questions, happy to answer them. If not, Matt, maybe jump to the next page. I want to give you a little bit of background on a special service district. These have been around a long time. And if you think about them, they were lots of ways that people improved sidewalks, parks, things like that in neighborhoods that really just benefited certain parts of a locality, and the other parts of the locality didn't want to pay for them. So service districts have been around a long time. The concept, though, is and one of the benefits to them is the local government forms it, right? It's purely at the discretion of the governing body of the jurisdiction, done by ordinance. It's done again by a geographical location, and the improvements that are funded obviously have to be within that geographical boundary. One of the benefits is there is not a direct burden on the overall larger community or tax base. So ultimately, the jurisdiction can levy a ad valorem special tax, just like an ad valorem tax, similar at least, on the real property within that geographical boundary. We'll call it a service district. And there's no limit as to what that amount is either. What you'll see in a moment that a CDA has some limitation on what that ad valorem or special tax can be without the consent of all of the landowners within the jurisdiction or within the special district. But here it's unlimited. And we have used these types of this type of structure for all kinds of infrastructure projects in Virginia. Oftentimes, again, they're done with a combination of some type of backing from the local government. You know, this isn't depending on the size of the area that we're talking about, it may not rise to the level of a credit quality that a lender is willing to lend based on. But with, for example, a moral obligation of a local government behind it, I wouldn't see any issue in Virginia with a jurisdiction being able to borrow using this service district as the generator of the revenues that would pay for the debt. Again, one of the best benefits is to the extent that real estate values may fluctuate within that service district, the local government can raise or lower the special tax within that area as well to make sure they're generating enough revenue to pay the debt service. And again, the monies that are collected have to be segregated. They can't be used in other parts of the jurisdiction. They have to be used specifically within the service district. Jump to the next page, Matt. Again, we hit on this a little bit. Again, they're typically infrastructure improvements within the area, fairly broad description. One of the things is that the service district does not have the ability to issue debt in and of itself. It's not a separate political subdivision in Virginia, but it is a part of whatever local government forms it. So the local government, let's just say Henrico County would actually have to issue the debt on behalf of on behalf of the service district projects, collect the special tax within that area, and use that special tax to repay the debt that Henrico County would issue. Again, you could also issue it from through an industrial development authority or an economic development authority within that jurisdiction as well. Jump to the next slide, Matt. All right, so a CDA, similar to a service district, CDA stands for a Community Development Authority. This was set up probably 30 years ago or so, maybe more than that. The first one that was ever done was in Loudoun County. Matt mentioned Henrico. That was one that was done for the Short Pump Town Center. The infrastructure that was used or built with the debt that was issued by the CDA was all of the water, sewer, roads, BMPs, stormwater runoff collection areas that surrounded it. So Short Pump was done a very good model. It also incorporated a little bit of a TIF concept. It wasn't a statutory TIF, but Henrico used the incremental revenue that was produced within the CDA sort of on their own books to pay for that debt, really to be an incentive to the developer. So a CDA, again, has been around for a while. Any obligation that is issued by the CDA, in this case, the bonds actually are issued by the Community Development Authority, not by the local government that formed it, but can be secured by a special assessment that can be levied on the real property, just the taxable real property within that area, or a special tax similar to what we talked about with a service district. And to the extent that a landowner doesn't pay those taxes, the CDA can foreclose through the local government on that property the same way they would for a failure to pay real estate tax, for example. I mentioned the two different methods, the special tax and special assessment. They're laid out here below. A special tax, again, is similar to the service district, where it is a special tax that's limited, though, up to 25 cents per hundred of the assessed value, unless 100% of the landowners within that CDA district agree to a higher amount. So you really are in partnership with the landowners when you utilize a CDA, and in reality, it's the landowners that actually come to the local government to form the CDA. They have to petition, the landowners have to petition the local government to form the CDA. The local government cannot do it on its own, unlike a service district that's done purely at the discretion of the local government. A special assessment, a little bit different. The way it works is whatever amount of debt that the CDA issues, let's just say it's $10 million, and it comes to $1 million a year in annual debt service. The special assessment would be the total debt service on all of that debt over the life of the loan would be a lien on that property going forward, and the CDA would collect that amount from each of the property owners that would be proportioned to each of the landowners based on the size or the value of the land, and they would pay it every year. Unlike a special tax, again, it's not based on a pure 25 cents per hundred value of your property, for example, but it is based purely off the principal and interest on the debt that was borrowed for the improvements within the district. Let's jump to the next page. Again, a little bit of the distinctions between the two that are fairly important, because I think it goes to a little more of the control that the local government has. With respect to a service district and a CDA from the formation, again, the CDA is done purely by the landowner. Service district is done at the discretion of the local government. The issuer of the debt is a little bit different too. The CDA issues their own debt. With the service district, the local government would actually issue the debt. The revenue streams similar. Again, though, with the CDA, you have a little bit more limitation on the ability to generate the special tax, because you need 100% of the landowner's agreement to go above 25 cents per hundred. The projects that are involved, again, with a service district, it's purely at the local government's discretion what projects are done within that service district. With a CDA, more of a mutual agreement between the landowner and the local government as to what those specific improvements are. The impact on the local government's credit really depends on whether there's any backstop by the local government. With the CDA in the normal course, there's not some backing by it. So it's not a direct impact on the local government's credit rating. For example, with a service district, there may be the ones that I've seen typically have some type of moral obligation or backing by the local government. So it would have an impact on their overall credit rating. It may not be negative, but it would at least be taken into account. And the security to the bondholders, similar under both of these structures, meaning a lien ultimately on property within that area to repay the debt. So let me stop there. I'm happy to talk through some examples of these. I think I've seen them less used for resiliency projects than I have with just hard infrastructure. They certainly can be overlapping, in particular where there may be surface flooding and infrastructure that is in place related to that. So happy, Matt, to take any questions from the group or narrow it down and talk about anything that they would like to.
I have a question, Jimmy, if I could. Most of the CDA and service districts we've seen, tend to focus on just one locality. It seems like I guess if you've got multiple localities involved, particularly in the resilience space where the needs, cross multiple localities, whether it's coastal or whatever. Have you seen that, I guess, a CDA or service district where it was multiple localities? I know there, certain like regional infrastructure entities where they may all share in revenues from one commercial improvement that's in one locality, but where the actual property that the tax or special district fee would apply to is in multiple localities. Have you seen that much?
No, and I think Sean, you'd have to. I'm just thinking back here for a minute. I haven't thought of that question, but I think you would need to form them separately in each jurisdiction, just by way that the statute works. Obviously, those regional authorities that we talked about are certainly done cross jurisdictions, CVTA and VTA and Hampton Roads. And so I think that you have the ability at the General Assembly level to change the law a little bit, maybe, and allow for that multi-jurisdictional areas to be done. But right now, I don't know that you would be able to do these types of things across boundaries. We looked at, thinking back, there was one in Northern Virginia where the area did cross and was going to require us to enter into an agreement between the two counties because the CDA crossed the county line, and we were going to form two CDAs. Was my recollection.
Great, thank you.
Jimmy, is Sean. When you were talking about the service district being formed by the local government, and sometimes these districts are formed before there's any homes in it. Like a developer may create the service district, and as the homes are sold, they're in the service district. Creating a service district after there's development, homes, is there ever a case where a referendum is required, or can the local government truly just draw a circle around I'm thinking residential development and say, this is now a service district?
Yeah, no, I don't believe there is a referendum requirement. I mean, you can draw them, and I've absolutely have done that. Mature areas where they were coming in and doing some redevelopment within the area, and the geographical boundary, it doesn't even need to be doesn't need to be perfectly rectangular or square. It can meander around, sort of like a voting district, like an amoeba, but it has to be contiguous. and that can be done by road and everything. But no, you can draw it over an existing area. You obviously have to, the improvements have to benefit. There is some benefit analysis that needs to be done. Otherwise, there'd be no public purpose for the debt. Again, you can't put a tax on a certain area and then use those dollars for projects outside of that service district. So there has to be a nexus between the project and the properties that you're applying the special tax to.
Got it.
Jimmy, if the development occurs post establishment of the service district, you're saying that those new homeowners are now subject to the terms and conditions of that service district?
That's correct. That's right. And I suspect there is, I'm not a real estate lawyer, but I suspect there is something in the land records, I hope, that would give the notice to those future purchasers that, you know, not only is there the real estate tax that you're gonna be paying, but there is a special tax as well. Here's an example. We in Northern Virginia, the city of Alexandria, they built a metro rail station in Potomac Yards up there, and a pretty big project, but the metro station was a big deal, and for them, obviously it's from an environmental standpoint, lowers traffic, all that. It's important to them, and they put a service district in place in Potomac Yards that charged 25 cents per hundred in addition to the real estate tax that the city uses, collects those monies and uses it in particular to offset the cost of the metro station that they funded with a general obligation bond. So they pay for it themselves, but internally they're collecting additional revenue on those property owners to offset the cost of that metro station. And the obviously the benefit, if you thought about it, the property values in that area increased significantly once that metro station was even discussed. But once it was brought online, in particular, the value of their property. So there was a benefit specifically to those property owners of that infrastructure improvement that was put within Potomac Yards.
Thanks.
As you were talking, Jimmy, I recall that Fairfax County in particular created a special tax district for stormwater improvements. And the district itself is the whole county. And they add a cent to the ad valorem tax. You know, so now that increment or that revenue that the county gets must be used for stormwater. And I think that's what you said, there's fairly limited use of these tools towards resiliency. But I think that's the point we're getting to is, are we going to include in our plan a description of this so that some local governments may adopt, like if there's an area where there's a flood mitigation project that benefits of specific area, is it appropriate to apply to service districts? And I think,
Keep going. I'm sorry.
yeah, and I think most of it would be post development. So I think it's interesting if how much buy-in you must get from that area. I mean, if people are complaining about flood, I'm sure they're more willing to pay an incremental property tax.
Well, you know, we've seen obviously the concept of stormwater fees that are charged across the Commonwealth too. Those are at least the ones that I've seen have been across the entire jurisdiction based off of the forgot the term now, but it's basically based off the impervious property, impervious part of the land that somebody owns. The more equivalent units or something like that you have, the higher your stormwater fee is. And I've seen jurisdictions set up separate credits that they can borrow against that stormwater revenue for various projects. I've also seen jurisdictions establish that stormwater fee. It'd be the same thing that you're talking about with putting a service district across the entire county, and using those revenues for projects, but just as a part of their general revenues that they would receive. And if they borrowed for it, they're borrowing for it under their typical CIP. They're not segregating those monies and just using them for debt or for pay-go. So again, I think with local governments, the biggest issue is identifying revenues that are outside of their current budget, that they can attach and use for these types of projects. And the more you can find those new revenue streams that can pay for these projects, I think the more local governments, at least my experience with them, are going to be willing to take on those projects.
Any additional, if this is a small enough group, if anyone wants to chime in, just chime in, please. Jimmy, appreciate your time today. Just last call for any other additional questions.
What if, Sean, if anybody comes up with anything afterwards, you all know where to find me. I'm happy to shoot you a response if anybody comes with questions after your meeting.
Yep. Again, appreciate it, Jimmy. You're more than welcome to join us for our old business section, or have a good day.
All right. Talk to y'all soon.
Take
Have a
care.
great day. Bye now.
Matt, I'm going to turn it back to you for old business, please.
Great. Thanks, Sean. That was a great presentation. I think it really ties into some of our kind of lines of effort that we're have kind of established through our past meetings. So in our first meeting, we talked a lot about what was in phase 1, what we could do in phase 2, and work to try to organize all those different thoughts into 4 different lines of effort. And so here they are on the screen. Number 1, building the financial baseline. So being more informed, having more quantitative information on our assets and the status of resilience. We'll get to that. Then we'll get into making the financial case. So now that we have this information, how do we use it to drive action and to inform decisions? Our third line of effort is documenting opportunities for state support. So I think we talked a lot about those districts. A lot of that all is on the localities. Are there opportunities for the state to facilitate that? Talked about potential legislative changes for multi-jurisdictional funding or financial tools. So we'll get into that third. And then lastly is kind of overall, what additional guidance and information can we provide? So we're going to work through these 4 lines of effort. It's by and large a capture of what we've previously discussed with some additional input put in there. Again, to try to build this inventory of what is the type of financial information that we think is needed to move us forward across these 4 different lines of effort, so that we can work towards prioritizing that list of desired financial needs to get done in phase 2 versus what might need to happen in future efforts. So if there's plenty of opportunities during this old business section. If you have thoughts and want to add in to our list, please let me know. There's also opportunity to send us additional items to be added to the list between now and our next subcommittee meeting, so that we can work to build that out and kind of have a facilitated in-person discussion on how do we prioritize what actually gets done in phase 2 versus future efforts. So with that, get started with building the financial baseline. And so within this kind of line of effort further broken down into what is the value of the assets that are exposed to flooding. What does that that exposure of these assets, how does that translate into a financial risk? And those two items are very much tied into what project prioritization subcommittee is looking at. And they're looking at the impact assessment. We're kind of looking at it the same thing, but through the financial lens. Third, what is the financial supply and demand for resilience? So what are the projects? Where's money historically been spent? What is the current financial availability of funding for this work? And what do we think we need to go? Again, tying into project prioritization, and they're looking at kind of gaps analysis on projects and initiatives. And then third, do we have the capacity to invest in resilience and these financial tools, whether at the local level or elsewhere? So with the ties to the impact, just wanted to review how this impact assessment works, where we have our hazard, the flooding, the assets, whether it be built, natural, or human infrastructure, characterizing that and having some more information on either the flood and the assets to look at impacts. And then impacts are broken down into 4 different layers that have increasing details as we go down. So just a narrative description, which is pure qualitative. Then we start getting into more quantitative exposure. Are you in or out? Are you exposed to flooding? Yes or no? If so, are you sensitive to flooding, and does that cause a vulnerability to your asset or to the services that asset provides? And then further down is the risk. What is the consequence of that vulnerability? How does it impact the system? And again, this is kind of just showing it as you step down. We're trying to get more information into it so we can have a better understanding, have some more financial data to inform decision making moving forward. So based on prior subcommittee input, this is kind of an outline of some of the items we discussed at our last meeting. So we should have a baseline assessment for our assets. Specifically, there was a lot of discussion on natural infrastructure and needing to know the underlying baseline value for the natural infrastructure, tying that to the public trust doctrine that we're here at the state working to protect. Once you have a baseline, it allows you to track and monitor and evaluate and adapt over time kind of progress and trying to tie it to metrics. And that baseline value is more informative than just its overall what is the overall need for resilience, and throwing out big, very broad and general numbers. Having it more broken down was discussed as being more beneficial. So after receiving some of that input, DCR and VMRC met with VIMS, and Donna Biklovich is working on some of this natural infrastructure ecosystem services baseline evaluation. So they're looking at and have partnered with NOAA. I guess we've received funding from NOAA to do a study in the Middle Peninsula looking at the value that marshes and living shorelines provide for the communities and fisheries. This work is almost complete for this area, and they've started getting at some of the dollar figures. So in this 3-county region that they're looking, it's about 12,000 acres of tidal marshes, about 500 living shoreline projects. That's been equivalent. They've looked at it and think that those kind of habitats, that landscape provides $40 to $90 million a year of ecosystem services, which represents about 1.5 to 3.4 of that region's GDP. So this is a smaller case study. These numbers aren't for the entire study area of the Coastal Resilience Master Plan, but could potentially be scaled larger to try to understand what is the value of our natural infrastructure across our entire project region. But this is just one example of some of the valuation that's going on. Another example is coming from USGS that was looking in primarily Chesapeake Bay and looking at the valuation for sediment retention as well as nutrient retention, part of the Chesapeake Bay work that we're focusing on water quality. But they also looked at quantifying floodplain values through flood regulation and the potential values that it has. So just again, sharing some of the data, Virginia, second to the bottom, they have calculated a net nitrogen benefit per stream length. Again, something that potentially could be scaled out across this project area or something that we want to look into. They have some figures in here, again, looking at nitrogen value, as well as some of the erosion and sedimentation that's based on locality. So really just trying to share some of the information that there are different ways to look at building this baseline. A lot of different state and local agency or state and federal agencies are looking into this, but it's still kind of being discussed. Grab this figure from the USGS report that is interesting, that just ties where those values are depend on the landscape and what's going on in the land. So both looking at the terrain, the topology of the area, as well as the activities where it's forested, agriculture, or more urban, where there's more potential for either nutrient reduction or erosion reduction. And potentially looking at seeing how we could tie something similar within our project area. They did a small case study in the Schuylkill River as far as looking at annualized floodplain avoided damages based on what's currently in existence, and then this counterfactual or just kind of hypothetical flood boundary, and looking at the potential benefits from having floodplain regulations in place and coming up with annualized dollar figures there. So not saying we are doing this for our project, but just bringing it up as an example of some of the financial research that's going on in this space. And we could look at bringing some of this to our project area, or maybe just referring to it in the plan itself. Another example comes from FEMA, and they released an updated benefit cost analysis toolkit that includes ecosystem services by land cover types with a acre per year value. And so they've got total estimated benefits across about a dozen different ecosystem services through about, I think that's 8 or so different land cover categories. I'll note in here, they have the riparian land cover category. It has the highest value with the exception of beaches and dunes. The beaches and dunes largely tied to aesthetic and tourism. That's something we could look at using. The riparian value, I was looking into this some more. This is mainly for areas out west where there's a large difference between evaporation and precipitation. And so I think looking at it just up front as like riparian, that's our floodplain. Perhaps we could use that for our analysis, but looking into it a little deeper, not the best representation, but we could use the forest, coastal wetlands, inland wetland values potentially across looking at the land cover data that we have to provide an estimate of the current benefits that are provided, look at those changes over time. And this is a FEMA provided number that they are using in their benefit cost analysis. And I'm not sure exactly which grants or funding mechanisms this is being used for within their funding. I don't know if Robbie, you know where this is actually being applied, but I think it has some of the FEMA backing. It has some potential for us to at least develop some numbers, which could help inform us in planning, but could also help with local applicants to understand values now versus values after a potential project to try to get this included into some of their funding and grant applications.
Yeah, Matt, if there's something specific that you want me to reach out to FEMA on to support the discussion, I certainly can.
Okay. Yeah, I'll reach out to you, Robbie. I think for me, it's which is this for brick or is this what all the different funding, where could this be used to help share that with localities as a potential tool? And then is that something that we should invest in as the state to provide some of that underlying data to support those applications as well as to inform our planning?
Sure.
So that's a lot on the natural infrastructure side and building a baseline. Again, there's options. There's no best product. Doesn't currently really exist. But I think it's something that we could work through, and I think it adds value and provides a contrast to the housing value and the economic data that we have now to have some natural infrastructure data built into this effort as well. Beyond that, so just kind of on the building the financial baseline, is there other financial information we could put in here to give some more context to where the impacts are and potentially how those impacts could be addressed by looking at some of the economic indicators? And so whether it's GDP, per capita income, looking to see how those relate to the flood hazards and where flooding is occurring, what do the economics look like in those areas? We also have the financial capacity. So in phase 1, we utilized the DHCD's local fiscal stress index. There's some other components that we could look at, whether it's the tax revenue dependence, economic vulnerability, or those are all combined to have local vulnerability indexes. I don't know if there's any interest in aggregating some of those into more regional metrics beyond what is currently presented at the locality scale, or if there's different products that we should consider to, again, provide more context to our financial baseline in this region to be able to plan and really implement resilience actions. So if you know of any other metrics or data that we should consider, please let us know, either in the chat, send us an email. Happy to look into it and try to figure out how to provide additional context to where flooding is happening to help identify what's needed and try to identify where our priority needs are moving forward.
Hey, Matt, I know they like just came out, but I was taking a look at what FEMA published for their community disaster resilience zones. There's 13 census tracts in Virginia that met their criteria, and I just saw the map come out like yesterday. I don't know if you've seen it, but they're mostly along the Middle Peninsula, Eastern Shore, Northern Neck.
Yep.
So you nod your head. So just wondering if, I don't know how useful it is, because it's a very specific, like, I guess, assessment that they did. So I just wanted to bring that to your attention, but I see that you probably already are aware.
You're about 2 slides ahead of me.
I'm sorry, man. I'm sorry.
You're good. No, but that's yes. And we'll get to that. Give me one more slide and I'll get to that, Robbie. So we're just looking at kind of fiscal locality numbers, economic, as well as fiscal stress. What we also don't have metrics on or measurements are is kind of the financial readiness. So just because you might have good economic prosperity or high income, do you actually have the staff and capacity to go after federal funds and really kind of work with these financial tools? And so this is a question that I'm putting out there. Is this something we should work to understand better? And so readiness is the the measurement of our capacity to research, apply, win, and then if you win, manage those opportunities with resources. And so I was trying to think of different ways to try to get at this, looking at the annual operating budgets of localities or number of financial FTE staff or staff that could help support this. Looking on understanding how many opportunities are being reviewed, how many applications are going in, what's our win percentage, how are we how much money are we managing from other sources. These are all potential data metrics we could work towards if you all think this would add value to planning. Again, I don't know that we'll get to all of these metrics in phase 2, but if it's a desired need, these are types of items that could be built into recommendations for future efforts. So again, potential options for consideration, and we'll discuss it more in our next meeting on how important in this, where does it fit in priorities, and then is it feasible and reasonable to get done now or in the future. Robbie, getting to your point, there are a lot of different metrics that are being used at the federal and state level. And so where do these areas appear and where do they overlap? As far as, I think this is something we could look at, and looking at those focal areas from federal funding sources. And so if we know there's a need, trying to line up with where federal dollars could be coming from based on how they're measuring communities, as well as how the state is doing it with our low-income geographic areas and the opportunity zones from CFPF and the revolving funds, to both identify opportunities for those types of funding, but also to see where there's gaps. And if we have a need, that a flooding impact that needs to be addressed, but isn't within the federal kind of criteria for financial support or the state criteria, and does that locality need additional support, and trying to help close that gap is to understand, do we have a need? What are the resources available, whether at the federal, state level, and then what are the local resources to try to figure out, getting more towards those kind of the financial strategy for implementation. So yeah, there are different scales, right? The resilience zones are census tract. There's some different data. I think the climate and economic justice mapper, you can look at the tract view or at the county or locality level. But I think it would be, I don't know that we've overlaid and looked at all of those different options geographically to see where there's overlap and where there's gaps relative to flooding. So again, we could add in other mapped metrics that are out there where there is what's part of kind of a funding criteria, or that there's emphasis for additional funding in these areas to help us better map and see where the money could flow versus where the risk is, to understand if we have gaps, and to help inform and advocate for funding in those areas. Is that what you were kind of thinking of, Robbie? Great. Other potential context that we've discussed before, kind of understanding the staff and financial resources and the PDCs and local government to help have sustainable capacity to move this forward. The shared risk and trying to better understand the indirect costs of flooding to the people, economy, and environment. That's when we're talking about the special districts and there having to be a benefit. Well, some of our indirect benefits travel pretty far, and I wonder how creative we could get with some of these tools and products based on some of the results. I think like of a transportation project, that benefit could be very broad depending on where people are coming from and using that road, and what businesses work from that road. So I think the shared benefits and co-benefits are another kind of items that we can try to work towards having a better understanding and building our financial baseline for that. This is the last slide on this line of effort. Any other questions or comments before we get into making the financial case? All right. So our second line of effort, making the financial case, and how are we communicating and sharing this information? Some of the feedback we got in our first meeting was, well, we need tailored messaging. If for the Coastal Resilience Master Plan, if our primary audience or our end users are PDCs, localities, and state agencies, well, we need to know what their interests are to try to better present this information. And so how do we work to gather some of these different perspectives? Got some slides on what we learned in phase 1 and what we're looking at learning in phase 2, and then some information sharing at the end. So we went back and looked at the phase 1 survey that we sent out to different organizations that were involved in resilience and flooding in our region or within the project area. This is just who responded to our survey. So just under half of the localities responded, and just over half of the PDCs responded to our survey. So that's who it represents. I think this information presented here is when we get to, well, what information gathering are we doing for phase 2? Not everybody participated, so we may be asking the same question again, a little bit different, but trying to increase the participation rate. But even from those that we did participate with, breaking some of the questions down into how aware are you of flood risk? Most of the people are moderately to significantly aware. Then kind of, do you understand the adaptation options to help deal with this risk? And it starts skewing further back towards some. Do you have the planning capacity for dealing with this problem? Again, kind of in the middle, a little bit further back, we're losing our significant side. And then do you have the funding capacity? And we have a shift even more towards the very little side. So this, I think, helps us understand. People feel like they understand flooding. They know where flooding is happening. They have some ideas on how to address it. They have some capacity to plan for it, but where the challenge is, well, I don't know how to get the money for it. We don't have the capacity to fund it. So that was a good lesson to pull out of that data. The next slide, again, just another way of representing it, where people have some, they tend to stay pretty consistent, but it's the change on risk awareness where we're diving down in significant, and our none is increases when we get to funding capacity. So same message, just a different way. As part of that survey, we asked, what funding and financial tools have you considered for coastal resilience? You'll see the top 3 are grants. That was what people are considering the most. How do I get free money? How do I get your money to help pay for this? In the middle, it's much more narrow, where we look at taxes, fees, special assessments, bonds, and loans. That is not being considered as much. And so, I mean, I'm curious to know how many localities would actually have an open line of credit that they could leverage to either do this or to leverage for cost share for some of those federal grants. And trying to maybe take some of the information we learned from the presentation earlier today. I think, like Sean said, how can we inform people how those tools could be used for resilience? And instead of just having our kind of table in the plan, actually having some of those info sheets say, here's what this tool is, here's kind of how it works, and here's how you could make it work for resilience challenges. So again, this is some of the information that we received from phase 1. Now we're looking at, well, how do we build upon that for this second effort 2 years later. There's a variety of different methods that we could use, whether it's workshops, surveys, interviews. We are really focused on regional and local decision making. And some of the questions should be asking these questions to the administrators in localities, the commissioners across the PDC. Who's the right people to be asking? And then what are the right questions we need to be asking? And some of this we're working with our outreach and coordination subcommittee. So the next two slides are draft survey questions that we plan on sending out. And this is just the financial questions within the larger survey, which also gets to how did you use the plan? What do you think you could use the plan for? On this financial side, these are some of the questions that we are looking at sending out. Right now, we'd be distributing it to, we have a list of floodplain administrators throughout for each locality that we can send this to, as well as we would hope to send it to our PDCs that are on the TAC, and then any other avenues that people are aware of that we could try to get this to the right people. So that's one question. If you know of any different contact lists or have any recommendations for distributing the survey to get responses, please let us know. This is something we're trying to get out. I guess it's November already, later this month. And so here are some of the questions. So what types of financing have you used for resilience activities? So not just within the locality, but specifically, we were looking at questions for flood resilience, whether it's different types of bond, taxes, funds, grants, or another write-in. What have you sought to use? So first one, what have you been successful with? What have you kind of considered or looked to use, but maybe did not? And then what are the barriers preventing you from seeking or accessing different financial tools for flood resilience answers? Any thoughts, comments, or concerns on these questions? All right. The next two questions, trying to understand where do they think the state could provide additional support? Again, this is mainly going out to regional and local entities, but where do they think, what if there's a barrier from before, do they think any of these options could help them be more successful in using these tools, or let us know and write it in? And that's also kind of what the last question is. What else can the state do to support the flood resilience efforts that they're dealing with? So we tried to keep it short. It's 5 questions on the financial side. I think it's about 5 on kind of the project and prioritization planning side as well. But we are presenting this to the outreach and coordination subcommittee. He's talking about it a little bit on the 8th, and then are hoping to get this distributed soon thereafter, so we can use this to also inform some of our prioritization at the next meeting, as far as what responses did we receive to help guide where we go on the funding side, as well as on the project prioritization side, and looking at impacts and how it's reported. So beyond the survey, just some information sharing. The National Institute of Building Sciences recently released a resilience incentivization roadmap. And there's 3 key findings that I wanted to share here. We often see $1 of mitigation in planning can save maybe $4 of recovery for build infrastructure, $7 of recovery for natural infrastructure, but a lot of $1 in saves you more later. But it never says who's paying the dollar and who's saving later. And that's what this first finding says. Mitigation saves, but it's not proportional to the individuals and of who's investing in that. right? So this is a shared risk and shared benefit. And the co-beneficiaries can and should maybe share the investments in order to get some of those benefits. But in order to do so, public and private coordination is essential. So looking at the figure on the right, the left side shows if a homeowner invests in floodproofing or elevation for their property, they don't even have a positive BCA ratio, but that benefit is shared across state, federal, local governments, future owners, and lenders, but they need to invest it. The slide or section B shows, well, what if those costs, that investment is shared across the co-beneficiaries, where everybody still has a net positive return on their investment? So how do we get to that? It's kind of the purpose of this report. They are actually looking to do pilot programs and looking at trade development impact fees for resilience, or HELOCs for resilience, tax relief for resilience. They're looking for communities that want to partner with the National Institute of Building Sciences to try to test these this theory of how do we distribute the investment to all recognize the benefits. And then so it would include homeowners, developers, local, state, or federal government, insurers, lenders, real estate agents, GSEs, investors, and engineers doing the work. So if you know of a locality that would be interested, they are looking for one that kind of has some financial structure in place and is already in this space, and it's not starting from day one, but that wants to look at essentially experimenting and testing out some different methods to get money and incentivize people to invest in resilience and share those benefits. So I wanted to share that out. The link, the report is linked on that on the slide there, and it should work for you. If you are interested in more, let me know, and I can share you that as well. All right, any questions on line of effort 2 and making the financial case and trying to understand how to tailor a message to better convey the information we're developing? All right, moving on to our third line of effort is identifying where the state can support and provide leadership in these areas. And so where is additional state support needed? What would that look like? What are the challenges that exist? Can the state do it? Are they prohibited? Is there legislative, administrative, or just operational changes? Are there local led programs right now that could be scaled to the state, or at least maybe exported to other regions of the state to build from? So those are some of the questions that we could look to try to answer and put together, kind of trying to put this together. And I have a lot of fill in the blanks. And so looking for your all's help on trying to demonstrate where these programs currently exist. What are the gaps and opportunities? And then are there other programs going on outside of Virginia that we could look to? In phase 1 of the Coastal Resilience Master Plan, we had New Jersey's Blue Acre program come and present and talk about some of the relocation program they're doing that's led at the state level in New Jersey. Are there others that we should consider? One of the questions that I have is kind of on financial training and technical support. How much should the state be providing? Is this something we should provide beyond just delivering the plan and walking away? Should we continue to provide and have capacity for technical support on the financial side to help localities move forward where it makes sense? Not saying that it has to be housed here, but just within the state itself, is that something that is needed, and is that a current gap or opportunity? So if you have any questions, if I put something in the wrong box, let me know. But I think it's something we can build on here and try to help with in communicating the plan. What is working? Where can we where do we need to shift from maybe a local led to a state led or vice versa? What works and doesn't work to help us move forward in this space? All right. Any questions on this line of effort?
I think you're on target with the technical assistance for finance or the financial piece. You know, we're seeing that a lot on our side. I'm sure other state agencies are too, but I'm glad you got that on there.
Great. Thanks, Robbie. Okay. All right, last line of effort, providing guidance and information. So these are some of the tool sheets we talked about, the financial process mapping, and then I have two other items included that we just previously discussed, parametric insurance, and then mapping private versus public land, and kind of how that works into some of the financial tools. So first, financial tool sheets. Again, wanting to expand upon the limited information provided in phase one, but I mean, there is information on bonds that is out there, but how do we make it relevant to Virginia, as well as making it relevant to resilience to add value and not just have a Wikipedia page on local loans and bonding or financing. So I think that's where, based on our discussion, where we want to go. So some of the questions that we could answer in those tool sheets is, well, does Virginia code allow for it, or do we need are there any legislative changes that may be needed? Where has it worked? So that gets to some of our case studies. Where in Virginia has it worked? Where beyond Virginia has it worked? What are some of the challenges that prevent it? Again, to try to find out then what are the opportunities to address that, and not just state it's an issue, but try to come up with a solution. How do these different tools influence behavior? And are there behaviors we're looking to change? Are private companies leveraging these financial tools? Or how do we tie it back into kind of the private money that's investing in these different areas to work and help us be more resilient? Again, what tools might be better suited for the state agency to provide more leadership and role to help coordinate that, especially beyond just an individual jurisdiction. We talked earlier that our problem is beyond a parcel and a locality scale. It is regional. The water does not care where those lines are. So how do we deal with that challenge? And does the state need to provide additional support to help deal with that? And then if there's localities that are lacking the capacity, is there something, should the state be providing something to augment and provide additional help for those localities that are lacking capacity, potentially high risk, vulnerable populations? Don't have the metrics to decide who that would be, but is that something we should be considering to allocate and prioritize the resources that the state currently has, or maybe we need more resources to help provide that support? So this is a list of some of the financial tools that exist and that we could build our tool sheets for. This list largely comes from NOAA put out a document for funding and financing and options to consider. Again, taking this information, making it relevant to Virginia and relevant to the flood resilience challenges that we face. Are we missing anything? Should things be crossed off the list or grouped together or broken out differently? I know we don't have the tax incremental financing in here. We could add that as a separate bullet. And maybe we need to talk about how these tools could be paired or work together, right? And not just a single tool, but you may need to have multiple tools to actually get to the solution. So any thoughts on this list, whether we need to add or delete from the funding and financing side? Okay. In addition to funding and financing, I listed these as kind of financial adjacent tools. Other types of, whether it's policy or programs that could impact and help drive us to be more resilient. So the purchase or transfer of development rights, how we use land use value assessments, and do we incorporate resilience into that? Easements, whether it's our conservation easements, and a lot of that conservation easements, we have a flood resilience benefit from lands that are being conserved. I don't know that we're really capturing and tracking and selling that as a benefit for flood resilience. But then there's rolling easements and climate easements, especially as the boundary line changes, particularly with sea level rise, but also as we start looking at the pluvial flood mapping for today and the future, and some of the fluvial flood mapping, we're dealing with lines that are going to be moving over time. And should some of these tools be considered, and should we include them in the master plan document and try to again expand upon it and try to show the link between this tool and how it could be used in Virginia for flood resilience? So any thoughts or feedback on some of these additional adjacent tools? And I'm more than happy to change that title. I just couldn't think of something better. Okay. Next up, so beyond our tools, but kind of how do the tools work? And what are the different steps along the way to map out the thinking about it, implementing the tool, managing the tool, and what are some of the kind of decisions that you need to make and think of along the way so that you can be successful? So in our last meeting, we talked about financial process mapping and understanding and breaking it down, having this flow chart, discussing some of the cash flow requirements, especially for reimbursable grants, best practices for success, some of that decision support tool. I don't know that we need a financial process map for every financial tool, nor do I think we'll get that done in time. But again, just something to consider if we go back to this list. Are there already financial tools that are well understood that people don't need additional information? But going back to the earlier survey where people are not considering taxes, loans, special assessment areas, one, understanding why they aren't in this space. And if it's because they don't understand the tool or how it could be applied, that's an opportunity where we can provide more information of how that could be successfully applied in the resilience space. So I think that'll be part of the discussion at the next meeting. Again, what's most important to get done in phase 2? What's feasible? And then what becomes recommendations for future work that we should continue to build on because we think it'll add value to this work that we're doing. All right. The last 2 slides are on some of these other items that we talked about. What is on parametric insurance? And I don't think Louis is on here, but this is one that he's been looking at and working with. And I think he's got a couple project ideas between the pilot projects and some other ideas at trying to get this established, but brought up the idea of a feasibility study. And so parametric insurance the insurers use a tide gauge, and as soon as a water elevation threshold is met, they will pay out on a policy within a certain region. That type of insurance does not exist in Virginia. I'm not sure if it exists in the US. There are areas in Europe that have this and are implementing it. One of the challenges that we face to having this type of coverage is the tidal or any kind of water level monitoring network that has to meet certain requirements in order for them to use it for insurance purposes. And then the area that that individual gauge could cover, because there's limitations on that. And so this is kind of what a feasibility study could look like, a desktop study looking at trying to answer some of those questions, and ultimately what is needed to implement parametric insurance in Virginia. What does that cost look like? Is that our cost, the insurance company's cost? And if that cost is likely too large to do at once, are there areas that should be prioritized or phased in to help provide this information? We tried connecting, or we did connect Louis with VDEM's flood intel unit, who used to work, I guess it was the iFlow system, but they're updating and adding some new gauges across the Commonwealth. And they're putting a couple of new tide gauges in Middle Peninsula, one in Gwynn and one in Tappahannock. But unfortunately, the what is it? The piece of equipment that they're using, the tide gauge, essentially does not meet the parametric insurance requirements. So again, trying to understand what's the gap between what's getting installed and what's needed. Is there flexibility to, in future installations, to upgrade a tidal station to meet that additional requirement, so that we don't need two gauges next to each other, one for parametric and one for water monitoring. So we're trying to work on coordinating that, and seeing what that looks like. So this is, again, another potential study we could try to build into phase 2, maybe. Could be something that expands, goes beyond it, just and gets released later as just a supplemental document. So for consideration. Lastly is the public versus private land
Yeah,
data
Matt,
set.
before you move on, the RISE, our resilience nonprofit here at DHCD, does have an insurance challenge that is ongoing right now. I believe Louis is somewhat aware of that, but it's very engaged in asking some of those very same questions right now, and trying to fund independent, incubators or accelerators to see what the ideas are and how it can be utilized in Virginia. So just information, and it probably is worthwhile to have them give maybe a presentation just on this alone, that insurance challenge that's ongoing.
Okay. Thanks, Bill. I know Louis is attacking this from many different angles and trying to make sure we definitely don't want to duplicate what he's already doing or trying to apply for, but also interested to see where the RISE challenge is and what they're coming up with. And that could, again, understanding where that's at, and could be another case study or something to feature within the plan to help build awareness. Okay, private and public lands database. We don't have this at large scale readily available. In each locality, the parcel data, they have the attributes for it. You've got to crosswalk it, but every locality maps it differently and uses different terms and fields. It's a challenge. And so to look at it at state scale has continued to be a challenge to understand where are private lands versus public lands at scale. The one data set we do have, DCR has a managed conservation lands map that looks at federal local lands that are managed for conservation. So it isn't all publicly owned lands. It's like the public courthouse, owned by the locality for the most part, but not managed for conservation, so therefore not in this database. So again, we have some data, it's not as comprehensive. Is this something that we think we need to invest in to further understand where we can implement some of the projects and how we implement it? There's a lot of discussions at our last meeting about Virginia being a low water state, and where, if you're building something in the physical environment, you're building it on state lands versus private lands along the shorelines, and what those different solutions look like, have different costs, to try to understand the context of those challenges, so that when we're looking at potential solutions or where there are needs, how do we incorporate that into our evaluation of different alternatives as to what could be successfully built here, if that is the chosen path to resilience. So this is again presented as another kind of existing data gap. I don't know if it's one we will cover in phase 2, but again, this is one of the items we could prioritize in our list. And if we don't get to it now, again, it becomes a documented recommendation of something we need to move forward towards. And hopefully some of those recommendations we can start figuring out, well, who's going to be responsible for this, how is it going to get done, and what time frame, and have more of an actionable recommendation to move us forward. Lastly, on this line of effort of just guidance and information, getting back to training and technical support, again, overlapping with some of our other lines of effort, but what is needed beyond what is included in the plan? Just because we put it in the plan, put it out there, doesn't mean that people are going to be ready to use it and off on their way and our job is done. Do we continue again to provide training and technical support to build financial capacity, where we're asking for either localities or regions to implement these plans? What type of support are we going to have beyond delivering this plan in December 24 to help us implement and get to where we want to be? So kind of a question putting out there, and whether again that becomes priority or recommendation moving forward. Any comments or questions on that line of effort or any of those other old business items? Okay. So talked about it throughout the day. So kind of our next steps. So prior to our next meeting, if you have any financial needs that you think need to be included to what was already presented today across those 4 different lines of effort, please let us know. Email me, call me, get me the information, and we can put it in there. We're going to work to organize it so that we can have a facilitated discussion at our next meeting, which will be in person, to understand how do we prioritize of this long list of needs that we have, or desires, wants. What are we going to do for phase 2? What's for future work, and what becomes a recommendation? The other item that we're looking at covering that was recommended at our last meeting was to have an overview of other state and regional plans and what are they including in their financial sections. What type of data were they looking at to help maybe inform our prioritization, understanding what others have done. So that's on our to-do list, and trying to work and get that done. Any questions for where we're kind of going with this in our next meeting? All right. With that, that is the end of the old business section. I'll hand it back over to Sean for new business.
Does any subcommittee member have any new business for discussion? Hearing none, I'm assuming there's no new business that anyone wants to bring forward. So the next item on the agenda. Sorry, is that the new business, Matt?
Sorry, I always forget where this slide is. It's kind of new business. It probably should have been a slide back with next steps. Action item review. There are, so for you all, if you have any additional items to add to the list, let me know. I know I've got Bill mentioned connecting with Rise and the insurance challenge and having them as a potential presenter. We'll get in touch with you, Bill. The other was Robbie for DCR. If we have specific needs related to that ecosystem services BCA tool that they have, we'll send Robbie an email to follow up on that to better understand how FEMA is utilizing that tool and where it's being applied to make funding decisions. I think those were the main action items that we have. If not, if I missed anything, we are taking meeting minutes. Those will be sent out within 10 days of this meeting, and the old meeting minutes will be posted within 3 days. So that is action items. The next is the Q1 meeting, and picking a date, time, location, and discussed agenda items. But if you have any recommendations for other agenda items, please reach out to Sean and make your recommendation known for consideration. Our next meeting will need to be in person. We cannot have 2 concurrent subcommittee meetings that are all virtual. So look for that invitation to be coming out in the next, hopefully sometime next week. We pick a date, time, and location and get that invitation out to the team. All right. So hand it back to you, Sean, for public comments.
Is there any public comment? Wheeler, I'm
There-
looking at you.
There are no members of the public in attendance. We had one and she left.
Thank you. Next item is adjournment. Can we just, I guess, do a motion to adjourn? Or can we
Moved.
just? Second? Do I hear a second?
Second.
Perfect. I'll say aye.
Aye.
That concludes the meeting. Thank you very much for everyone's time. Have a great afternoon.
You too.
Thanks, everyone.
Yep.
All good?